There is a sound that comes before sight in complete darkness. A drip, a slow, deliberate drip of water that has been falling for thousands of years, landing on a surface it has carved over millennia into shapes that no architect ever drew. The sound does not echo the way you might expect. It lands flat, absorbed by the water below, and then the silence closes back around it like something alive. A diver descends. The beam of a headlamp cuts through water so clear it barely seems like water at all, more like cold, blue air. The beam catches limestone formations, stalactites reaching down and stalagmites reaching up, some of them meeting in columns that have been growing since the last ice age, since before any human civilization put a name to anything. The diver moves slowly, following the curve of the passage, and then the light finds something that does not belong to geology: a human skull, resting on a submerged ledge as if placed there with intention. Around it, pottery shards, obsidian blades, the dark organic residue of offerings, long dissolved into the water. The skull faces outward toward whoever might enter. It has been looking this direction for perhaps 1,500 years. The diver does not touch anything. The diver has been trained not to touch anything, because what was left here was left with purpose, and disturbing that purpose, even now, even in an age that measures everything in data points and carbon ratios, feels like a violation of something that deserves more respect than casual curiosity. The diver takes photographs and backs slowly out of the chamber, and the skull returns to the dark, facing the direction of whoever comes next. This happened. Not in legend, not in the elaborated mythology of people who want underground spaces to be more dramatic than they are. This happened to researchers exploring the flooded cave systems of the Yucatan Peninsula, specifically in the network of submerged passages that stretches for hundreds of kilometers beneath the limestone shelf of southeastern Mexico. These passages have a name in the language of the people who knew them longest. They were part of a place called Xibalba, and Xibalba, in the cosmology of the ancient Maya, was not a metaphor. It was a place, a real place, accessible through specific entrances, governed by specific lords, subject to specific rules and dangers and possibilities. It was the underworld, the realm of the dead. The court where the human soul went after death and was tested, judged, and either destroyed or permitted to transform into something else entirely. The question that has occupied scholars, archaeologists, and cave divers for several decades now is not whether Xibalba existed in the Maya imagination. That is beyond doubt. The question is what the ancient Maya actually knew about the physical landscape beneath their feet, and how that knowledge shaped one of the most sophisticated and psychologically complex underworld mythologies in human history. Were the Maya simply projecting their fears onto a convenient darkness, the way many ancient civilizations did? Or were they describing something specific, something observed, something they had actually entered and explored and come back to report about in the only language available to them, which was the language of myth? The answers that have emerged from the flooded passages of the Yucatan in recent decades are more complicated and considerably more astonishing than either the purely mythological interpretation or the purely physical one can accommodate. Because what we have found down there, in the dark below the limestone, suggests that the Maya were doing something in those caves that goes well beyond depositing offerings at a cave entrance and calling it a day, They were going deep. They were going very, very deep, and they were leaving evidence of what they found. Tonight, we are going in after them. Drop a comment below and tell me where in the world you are watching from. And if this kind of slow, careful descent into history is something you want more of, hit subscribe. Because the passage goes much further than a single night can cover. To understand Xibalba, you have to understand the ground above it. And the ground above it is unlike almost any other landscape in the Western Hemisphere. The Yucatan Peninsula, that broad thumb of land that juts northward into the Gulf of Mexico, and the Caribbean, is made almost entirely of limestone. Not limestone mixed with other rock, not limestone as one geological feature among several, but limestone in the most complete and dominating sense possible. A platform of fossilized marine sediment that formed when this entire region sat beneath a shallow tropical sea, hundreds of millions of years before anything resembling a human civilization appeared on the planet. Limestone is a rock with a particular vulnerability. It dissolves, not in ordinary water, but in water that carries even small amounts of carbonic acid, which is to say, in rainwater, which absorbs carbon dioxide from the air and the soil and becomes mildly acidic as a result. In the tropics, where rainfall is heavy and vegetation is dense and the carbon cycle operates at full intensity, this acidic rainwater works on limestone with a patience that is difficult to fully comprehend on human timescales. It finds cracks in the rock. It enlarges those cracks. It moves through the rock, dissolving as it goes, creating passages that grow over thousands and millions of years into something vast. The Yucatan has been doing this for a very long time. The result is one of the most extensive karst landscapes on Earth. Karst is the geological term for terrain shaped by the dissolution of soluble rocks, terrain characterized by sinkholes, disappearing streams, caves, and underground drainage systems. The Yucatan is karst on a scale that staggers specialists who have studied it for decades. Beneath the relatively flat, scrubby surface, honeycombed with passages that, when measured collectively, constitute a drainage system of extraordinary scale and complexity. The most visible manifestations of this underground world on the surface are the cenotes. A cenote, pronounced approximately cenote in the Yucatec Maya language from which the Spanish word derives, is a natural sinkhole formed when the ceiling of an underground cavern collapses, exposing the water table below. Some cenotes are open pits, their water visible from the surface, surrounded by sheer limestone walls draped in roots that reach down from the vegetation above. Some are partially covered, their entrances like dark mouths in the earth, leading down to water visible only once your eyes adjust to the reduced light. Some are nearly completely enclosed, accessible only through a small opening that would not be obvious to someone who was not specifically looking for it. There are thousands of cenotes in the Yucatan Peninsula. Estimates of the total number vary, but the figure commonly cited by researchers working in the region is somewhere between 6,000 and 10,000, spread across the peninsula with a density that means that in many areas of the ancient Maya heartland, you are never more than a few kilometers from an accessible opening into the underground water system. For the Maya, who lived in this landscape continuously for thousands of years, the cenotes were not interesting geological features to be explained away. They were the entrances to another world. They were also, critically, the primary source of water in a region with almost no surface rivers. The Yucatan receives substantial rainfall, but that rainfall disappears into the ground almost immediately, absorbed by the porous limestone and drained into the underground aquifer. There are no rivers to speak of on the surface, no lakes of any significance. The water that sustains life in this landscape exists underground, and to reach it, you have to go into the earth. This is not a metaphorical statement about the Maya relationship with the underworld. It is a practical description of the hydrological reality that shaped daily life for every Maya community that ever existed in this region. The practical necessity of cenotes for survival meant that Maya communities were not simply aware of the entrances to the underground system. They were dependent on them in the most fundamental way possible. Water comes from the underground. Life comes from the underground. And if life comes from below, it becomes entirely logical to conclude that something essential about the relationship between the living and the dead, between the surface world and whatever lies beneath it, operates through the same passages that deliver water to the living. The cenote is not just a well, it is a membrane. The underwater cave systems connected to the cenotes are among the most extensive in the world. The Sistema Sac Actun, which runs beneath the municipality of Tulum on the Caribbean coast of Quintana Roo, was for many years believed to be the longest underwater cave system ever measured, stretching for over 300 kilometers of mapped passage. In 2018, divers working in the region connected the Sac Actun system to the adjacent Dos Ojos system, creating a single connected network of extraordinary length. The announcement of that connection made international news in the archaeology and exploration communities. It was described accurately as an extraordinary discovery. But what was less widely reported was that the discovery of the connection itself was made possible only by the existence of a much older infrastructure, a pathway, a cleared route through the cave that someone had prepared long before modern divers arrived with their equipment. Someone had been in there before. Someone who did not have an oxygen tank, or a wetsuit, or an underwater headlamp. Someone who navigated passages that flood seasonally, that change character depending on rainfall, that present challenges of orientation and darkness that would defeat most modern explorers without proper preparation. And that someone left evidence of their passage not just in the form of offerings placed at accessible points, but in the form of stone pathways, cleared rubble, and other infrastructure that implies sustained, purposeful use of the underwater system over an extended period. We will return to what that evidence means, but first, it is necessary to understand who built it and what they believed about the place where they were building it. Because, without the cosmological context, the physical evidence is just inexplicable archaeology. With the cosmological context, it becomes something else entirely. It becomes a map of a belief system so detailed, so internally consistent, and so profoundly rooted in actual physical experience that the boundary between mythology and geography begins to dissolve. The limestone platform of the Yucatan is, in geological terms, quite young. The reef systems that built it were active relatively recently in Earth's history, and the karst processes that created the cave network have been operating for only a fraction of the time that caves of comparable scale in other regions have been forming. What this means, practically, is that the cave network is highly dynamic. Passages that are currently flooded were not always flooded. During the last ice age, when global sea levels were substantially lower than they are today, and when the regional water table was correspondingly lower, many of the passages now submerged were dry. People could walk into them, and the evidence suggests that they did. The skeletal remains found in the underwater caves of the Yucatan are among the most significant and controversial archaeological discoveries of the past 3 decades. Human bones have been found at depths and in locations that, at the time they were deposited, would have been dry cave floors. The dating of these remains has produced some startling results. Some of the skeletal material found in the underwater caves dates to the early Holocene, the period immediately following the end of the last ice age, roughly 10 to 13,000 years ago. These are among the oldest human remains found anywhere in the Americas, and they were down there, in the dark, in passages that are now completely submerged. The question of how they got there, and why they were there in the first place, opens into a space of extraordinary complexity. Were they people who fell into the caves accidentally? Were they people who entered the caves deliberately and became lost? Were they people who were brought into the caves by others and left there with intention? The physical evidence does not resolve these questions easily, but the context provided by everything the Maya subsequently built above ground, and everything they subsequently described in their texts and art, suggests that the relationship between the Maya and the underground was not accidental. It was cultivated. It was maintained. It was, in the fullest sense of the word, sacred. There is a book. It is one of the most remarkable documents to survive from any pre-Columbian civilization, and it is worth pausing for a moment on the improbability of its survival before we begin to describe what it contains. The Popol Vuh, which translates approximately as the Book of the Community or the Book of Council, is the great mythological and historical narrative of the Quiche Maya, a Maya group whose descendants still live in the highlands of what is now Guatemala. The text was originally maintained in hieroglyphic form, as all Maya texts were, but after the Spanish conquest and the catastrophic destruction of Maya books by colonial authorities who regarded the hieroglyphic texts as works of the devil, the knowledge contained in those books survived in a precarious and remarkable way. It was transcribed by a Quiche Maya nobleman in the Quiche language, but using the Latin alphabet the Spanish had introduced sometime in the mid-16th century. The original manuscript was copied by a Dominican friar named Francisco Jimenez in the early 18th century, and it is this copy, now held at the Newberry Library in Chicago, that serves as the foundation for our knowledge of the text. The survival of the Popol Vuh is, by any measure, an extraordinary piece of luck. Most of what was written in Maya hieroglyphics was destroyed. The Popol Vuh made it through the destruction, largely because it was already transliterated into a European script before the most aggressive phases of colonial cultural erasure. Without it, we would have a much thinner understanding of Maya cosmology in general and of Xibalba in particular. With it, we have a text of great detail and enormous narrative complexity that describes the underworld not as a vague, dark place of punishment, but as a specific, organized, politically governed realm with named rulers, identified geography, and known rules of behavior. The central narrative of the Popol Vuh, the sequence that occupies the most elaborate section of the text, and that has the closest bearing on our subject tonight, concerns two pairs of twins. The first pair, 1 Hunahpu and 7 Hunahpu, are ball players, men whose skill at the Maya ball game is such that the noise of their playing disturbs the lords of Xibalba, the rulers of the underworld, who send messengers to summon them downward. This summons is, in the logic of the Popol Vuh, a death sentence dressed as an invitation. The lords of Xibalba do not summon people to honor them. They summon people to destroy them. The journey into Xibalba, as the Popol Vuh describes it, is not a simple descent. It is a passage through a landscape that is specifically designed to confuse, disorient, and ultimately destroy those who enter without sufficient knowledge or courage. The road to Xibalba passes through deep ravines. It passes through rivers, one of which runs with blood and one with pus, rivers that are traps for the ignorant, crossings that can be survived only if you know the trick of crossing them, which is not to cross them in the obvious way at all. Beyond the rivers lies the court of the Lords of Death, where the first challenge awaits. The lords have set up wooden mannequins dressed in their own finery, seated as if alive, and the visitor is expected to greet these mannequins as if they were the real lords. 1 Hunahpu and 7 Hunahpu fail this first test. They greet the mannequins. The real lords laugh at them. The humiliation that follows is the beginning of the end. What follows in the Popol Vuh is a catalogue of what the text calls the houses of Xibalba. Dark house, where darkness is total and unending. Rattling house, where cold penetrates to the bone and the wind never stops. Jaguar house, where jaguars prowl and consume. Bat house, where the creature Kamazots, the death bat, makes its home. Hot house, where fire is unrelenting. Razor house, where blades move on their own through the air. Each house is a specific test. Each test has a specific form of suffering attached to it. And each test, in the narrative logic of the Popol Vuh, is not random cruelty. It is a design challenge that can, theoretically, be survived by someone with the right knowledge and the right psychological preparation. 1 Hunahpu and 7 Hunahpu do not have that knowledge. They are defeated in the houses of Xibalba, and 1 Hunahpu is killed, his head placed in a calabash tree that stands near a road in the underworld. His head is still alive, in the way that things in the Popol Vuh can be simultaneously alive and dead, simultaneously present and absent. And the skull of 1 Hunahpu, hanging in the calabash tree, spits into the hand of a young woman, the daughter of one of the Lords of Death, and she becomes pregnant. The children she carries are Hunahpu and Xibalba, the hero twins. They are born, they grow, they become ball players of extraordinary skill, and they too attract the attention of the Lords of Xibalba and receive the same summons that destroyed their father and uncle. But the hero twins are different. They know what is coming. They have been prepared by knowledge, by experience, and by something that functions in the narrative as a combination of courage and wit, and a very specific refusal to behave in the way that fear would dictate. Their descent into Xibalba is a masterclass in the kind of intelligence the Maya most valued. When they come to the mannequins seated in the court of the Lords of Death, they do not greet them. When they are offered the seating of the Lords, they identify the hot stone seat and refuse to sit on it. they pass through the houses, and where one Hunahpu failed, they succeed, and their success is never about brute force. It is about knowing the rules, reading the situation correctly, maintaining composure under pressure that is specifically designed to break composure, and occasionally tricking the lords themselves at the lord's own game. The eventual defeat of the lords of Xibalba by the hero twins is accomplished not in direct combat, but through a sequence of transformations, performances, and reversals that culminate in the Lords of Death voluntarily asking to be killed, persuaded by a demonstration of the twins' power to bring the dead back to life. The Lords ask to be killed so that they can be resurrected. The twins oblige the first request and quietly omit the second. The Lords of Death are dead and will not be restored. Xibalba, in the aftermath of the hero twins' victory, is diminished. Its power over the living is broken, or at least reduced. The sacrifices it demands become smaller and less significant. The path through it, while still dangerous, becomes more survivable for those with sufficient knowledge and courage. This narrative has been analyzed by scholars from virtually every possible angle, and the richness of the text rewards that analysis at every level. At the mythological level, it is a creation narrative, a story about how the current order of the world came to be, in which the defeat of the Lords of Death is necessary for the establishment of the conditions that allow human life to flourish. At the ritual level, it provides a framework for understanding why the Maya performed certain ceremonies in certain places, why the ball game was both a sport and a sacred reenactment of cosmic events, why caves and cenotes required specific protocols and specific offerings before entry. At the geographical level, which is the level that interests us most tonight, it is a description of a place with specific terrain features, rivers with particular characteristics, houses with particular qualities, a road that leads downward in a specific direction, and a ball court, because even in Xibalba there is a ball court on which the fundamental game is played, the game that connects the living and the dead, and the cosmos all at once. What archaeologists have been discovering in the flooded caves of the Yucatan for the past 30 years is evidence that the Maya did not simply imagine this geography. They mapped it onto the physical landscape around them, and then they went in. The 12 Lords of Death named in the Popol Vuh are worth knowing, because their names tell you something important about what the Maya understood death to mean. They are not generalized figures of darkness and ending. They are specialists. 1 Death and 7 Death are the chief lords, the administrators of Xibalba's court. Pus demon and jaundice demon cause disease and suffering in the bodies of the living. Bone scepter and skull scepter cause wasting and death. Flying scab and gathered blood cause hemorrhage. Trash master and stab master preside over the places where the dead accumulate. Pack strap and zik, whose names refer to the carrying of burdens, are present at the moment of death, when the soul must be carried from one state to another. What is remarkable about this taxonomy of death is its precision. These are not abstract forces of evil in the way that the underworld figures of many other mythologies are abstract. They are functional specialists, each one governing a specific form of death or dying, each one requiring specific propitiation to be kept at bay. The Maya did not simply fear death. They categorized it, named its mechanisms, assigned responsibility for its various forms, and then developed relationships with those responsible parties that involved offering, negotiation, and ritual performance. This is not the theology of a people paralyzed by fear of the dark. It is the theology of a people who looked into the dark very carefully and decided to understand what they saw. Let us be precise about what has actually been found, because the precision matters more here than anywhere else. The caves of the Yucatan have generated a body of archaeological evidence over the past several decades that is genuinely significant, and it deserves to be described carefully and honestly, without the embellishment that these subjects tend to attract. The most systematic archaeological work in the underwater caves has been carried out by a series of teams working across different parts of the cave network, with some of the most consequential results coming from the research of the Gran Acuífero Maya project, led by Guillermo de Anda, and operating in close collaboration with cave divers who have the technical skills to reach the deeper and more remote sections of the system. De Anda and his colleagues have described a series of findings that, taken together, constitute a coherent and deeply significant picture of Maya activity in the underground system. Stone pathways have been found in several locations within the underwater cave system. These are not natural features. They are constructed walkways, cleared and in some cases paved or edged with stone, that run along the floor of passages that were dry during the periods when the Maya were using them. The pathways follow routes that are not the most obvious or direct routes through the caves. They meander. They pass specific features, specific formations, specific points that appear to have had ritual significance. They are not the infrastructure of a group trying to move efficiently from one point to another. They are the infrastructure of a group performing a journey that is as important for its route as for its destination. The objects found along and near these pathways represent a significant collection of Maya ritual material culture. Incense burners, some of them intact, some broken in ways that may themselves be ritualistic. Ceramic vessels of types associated with specific ceremonial contexts in the surface archaeological record. Obsidian blades, and obsidian is a material that does not occur naturally in the Yucatan limestone lowlands and must therefore have been imported from highland sources, which means its presence in the caves represents a deliberate investment of resources and logistical effort. Jade beads and fragments, jade being the material most closely associated with Maya concepts of preciousness, of royalty, and of the substance of the maize god himself, whose body in Maya iconography is often depicted as green and gem-like, and human remains. Human remains in quantities and configurations that go well beyond what accident or ordinary cave use would produce. Some of these remains are isolated bones, possibly moved from their original resting places by the water that flooded the caves. Some are articulated skeletons, meaning the bones are still in anatomical position, which means the body was deposited and left in a context where it remained undisturbed until the water rose and the cave was sealed. Some of the remains show evidence of perimortem treatment, meaning things done to the body around the time of death, that is consistent with sacrificial practices documented in the surface Maya archaeological record. The dating of the cave material presents challenges that are worth acknowledging honestly. Radiocarbon dating of organic material from the underwater caves has to account for the reservoir effect, which is the tendency of aquatic environments to produce dates that appear older than they actually are because of the way water systems interact with the carbon-14 that radiocarbon dating depends on. Researchers working in these caves have developed methods for correcting for this effect, but the corrections introduce a degree of uncertainty that requires careful accounting. With those caveats stated, the dates that have emerged from the material evidence suggest that the Maya were using the caves intensively across a long period, from roughly the early pre-classic period, beginning around 1000 BCE, through the Classic period, ending around 900 CE, with evidence of use continuing into the post-Classic period thereafter. One site within the cave system deserves extended description, not because it is the most spectacular in absolute terms, but because it is one of the most clearly documented, and because the description of it illustrates better than any general statement what the Maya were actually doing in these underground spaces. The site is the chamber known to researchers as the Temple of the Jaguar God, found in a section of cave in the eastern Yucatan that is currently accessible only to technical divers. The chamber is large by cave standards, with a ceiling high enough that the beam of an underwater light cannot fully illuminate it from the floor. Along one wall, a natural ledge has been modified, its surface leveled and extended with stone, creating a platform that does not occur in the natural cave environment. On and around this platform, researchers found ceramic vessels arranged in a pattern that strongly suggests intentional placement. The vessels are not identical. They span different periods of Maya ceramic production, which suggests that the chamber was used across an extended period, visited and revisited, and resupplied with offerings over what may be centuries. On the platform itself, in a central position, researchers found a ceramic vessel of a specific type that in Maya iconography is associated with the jaguar. The jaguar in Maya cosmology is a creature of the boundary between the surface world and the underworld. The jaguar's spots are associated with the night sky, with the darkness that is also the underworld, and the jaguar itself is one of the forms taken by the sun as it passes through Xibalba during the night. A jaguar vessel in this particular chamber, in this particular position, in a context surrounded by other vessels spanning a long period of use, is not a random choice. It is a statement about where you are and what that place means. Beyond the chamber with the jaguar vessel, deeper in the same system, researchers working at the edge of their technical capabilities found a passage that ends in a collapsed section that has never been fully cleared. Behind the collapse, ground-penetrating sonar has indicated a further chamber of significant size. What it contains is not known. The clearing of that collapsed section would require resources and logistical effort that have not yet been committed. It waits, as so many things in the underground wait, for the combination of will and funding and expertise that will eventually send someone in to look. The evidence of human sacrifice in the caves is among the most discussed and, in popular treatments of the subject, the most sensationalized aspect of the archaeological record. It deserves clear-eyed description. Human sacrifice in Maya culture was real. It is documented in the hieroglyphic texts, in the iconographic record, and in the osteological evidence from excavations at numerous surface sites. It was not the casual, constant butchery of the kind sometimes described in popular accounts. which tend to extrapolate from the most dramatic evidence and apply it universally. It was a specific ritual act, performed in specific contexts, at specific times, for specific purposes. In the cave context, the evidence for sacrificial practice includes skeletal remains that show signs of peri-mortem violence, bodies positioned in ways that suggest ritual placement rather than natural death, and the association of human remains with other offerings in configurations that parallel surface. Sacrificial contexts. The caves appear to have been particularly significant as locations for sacrificial practice during periods of crisis, drought being the most commonly cited, when the relationship between the Maya and the forces governing rainfall and agricultural productivity required the most serious forms of negotiation. Offering something precious into Xibalba, something that could not be retrieved, was perhaps the most extreme statement of sincerity that the Maya could make to the lords below. The human skull found in the chamber that opened this documentary is one of many such skulls documented in the cave system. Some of them are isolated, detached from their original skeletons by the water or by deliberate defleshing. Some are placed in specific orientations. Some are associated with other objects in ways that suggest they were arranged as components of a larger ritual tableau rather than simply deposited as individual offerings. And some of them, the ones that trouble researchers most, are in locations so deep within the cave system, so far from any entrance that could have been reached without the ability to navigate in complete darkness for extended distances, that the question of how they got there remains only partially answered. To enter Xibalba knowing what awaited you inside was not a suicidal gesture. It was a demonstration of something the Maya valued enormously and described with precision in both their texts and their iconography. The Maya called it wits, sometimes translated as power or authority, but which more accurately describes the quality of having mastered the relationship between the visible and invisible worlds. A person who could enter the underworld and return had demonstrated a mastery over death itself, not the abolition of death, not immunity from it, but the capacity to navigate it and emerge transformed. Understanding the Lords of Death requires understanding the Maya concept of death itself, which is considerably less linear than the concept familiar to most Western traditions. The Maya did not think of death as a single event marking a clean transition from life to non-life. Death, in Maya cosmology, was a process, an extended journey through a series of states and encounters, governed by powers that were themselves neither simply evil nor simply good, but functional, specialists in specific forms of transition. One Death and Seven Death, the chief lords of Xibalba, are not devils in the sense familiar from Western demonology. They are administrators. They maintain the order of the underworld the way that the administrators of a sophisticated bureaucratic system maintain order in a complex institution. They have rules, they have expectations, they have a court with its own protocols and its own hierarchy. And critically, they are not immune to being outplayed. The Hero Twins defeat them not because the Hero Twins are more powerful in any simple sense, but because they are more intelligent, more creative, and more willing to engage with the rules of Xibalba on Xibalba's own terms, rather than trying to impose surface world rules on an underground reality. This distinction matters for understanding why the Maya developed such an elaborate ritual protocol for cave entry and cave use. They were not trying to avoid the attention of the Lords of Death. They were trying to engage that attention correctly. An offering in a cave is not a bribe. It is an acknowledgement of jurisdiction. By entering the cave and performing the required rituals, the Maya priest or ruler was effectively stating, "I recognize that I am in your domain. I am behaving according to your rules. I am here with legitimate business, and I am prepared to provide the appropriate consideration for the audience I am requesting." This is the logic not of supplication to evil, but of diplomacy with a foreign power that happens to govern the territory you need access to. The specific lords named in the Popol Vuh map onto specific concerns of the Maya living world in ways that reinforce the diplomatic interpretation. Pus Demon and Jaundice Demon are the lords of disease. Their presence in the underworld bureaucracy reflects the Maya understanding that disease comes from below, from the dark and wet and invisible spaces where spirits congregate and from which influences rise into the visible world to afflict the living. Placating these lords, maintaining a correct relationship with them through appropriate ritual, was a component of Maya medicine as much as it was a component of Maya religion, which, in Maya understanding, were not separate categories. Bone Scepter and Skull Scepter, the lords of wasting death, were associated with the kind of death that comes slowly, that depletes the body over time, rather than ending it suddenly. In a society without modern medicine, where the distinction between a chronic illness and a fatal one was often unclear until very late in the process, the existence of specific lords governing this specific form of death gave Maya healers and priests a framework for intervention. You could address Bone Scepter directly, through ritual, through offering, through specific acts of propitiation, if you understood that Bone Scepter was the relevant power. The specificity of the taxonomy was not theological decoration, it was clinical protocol. Flying Scab and Gathered Blood are the lords of hemorrhagic death, death by bleeding. Their presence in the catalog of Xibalba's rulers reflects the reality of a society where childbirth, warfare, and accident all carried significant risk of death by blood loss, and where the relationship between blood and life was understood with an intimacy that modern Western cultures, insulated from most direct experience of blood, often struggle to fully appreciate. Blood in Maya cosmology is not merely the physical fluid that the body requires. It is the medium of communication between the living and the dead, the visible world and Xibalba. Blood offerings in Maya ritual are not about cruelty. They are about communication, sending something across the boundary in a form that the lords below can receive and recognize. The House of Darkness, the first of the houses through which the Popol Vuh sends its heroes, requires extended consideration, because darkness in the context of Maya cave use was not simply the absence of light. It was an environment with its own qualities, its own sensory character, and its own psychological effects that the Maya understood and deliberately engaged. Modern cave researchers who work in extended expeditions in completely dark environments report a consistent set of experiences: the loss of spatial reference, the intensification of sound, the heightening of other senses as vision becomes irrelevant, and at longer durations, perceptual experiences that were historically interpreted as visions or encounters with supernatural presences, and that are now understood as the brain's response to extended sensory deprivation. The Maya who used the caves in ritual contexts were aware of these effects. They may have cultivated them. The use of psychoactive substances in Maya ritual practice is documented. Tobacco, cacao in fermented forms, and various other plant preparations with psychoactive properties were employed in ceremonial contexts. In the enclosed darkness of a cave, with the sounds of water amplified and distorted by the acoustics of stone, with the temperature significantly lower than the tropical surface above, the addition of even mild psychoactive substances to the sensory environment would have produced experiences of considerable intensity. The visions, encounters, and underworld journeys reported by Maya shamans and priests in the context of cave ritual were not purely metaphorical. They were experienced as real by the people who had them, and the cave itself was the technology that produced them. The House of Cold, with its relentless wind and penetrating chill, maps precisely onto the physical reality of caves that draw cold air from deep underground storage toward their entrances. Anyone who has spent time at the mouth of a significant cave in a tropical environment has felt this: the remarkable cold that flows outward, a constant invisible river of chilled air from the deep earth. To people who understood air currents as the breath of the earth, as the exhalation of whatever inhabited the underground, this sensation would have been both literally present and cosmologically meaningful. The cave breathes. The breath is cold. What breathes in the dark beneath the earth? The answer the Popol Vuh provides is specific, detailed, and named. There is a question that tends to surface among people hearing about the Maya cave material for the first time, and it is worth addressing directly because the answer is genuinely astonishing. How did they see? What did they use for light in a cave environment where no natural illumination reaches, where the passages run for hundreds of meters in complete darkness, and where the navigation challenges without light are severe enough to disorient specialists with modern equipment? The evidence for Maya cave lighting is fragmentary but consistent. Ceramic censers, vessels designed for burning, have been found in cave contexts throughout the Maya world, including in locations well beyond any ambient light from the surface. Pine torches, specifically the resinous heartwood of the ocote pine that burn slowly and with significant light output, are documented in ethnohistoric records of cave ritual. Copal resin, which is also used as incense in Maya ritual contexts, burns with enough light to navigate by. And stalactite residue from several cave sites has been analyzed and found to contain carbon deposits consistent with long-term combustion, meaning that specific locations within caves were used repeatedly as fire points, as stations where light was maintained during extended ritual activities. But the lighting tells only part of the story. Navigation in cave systems is a technical problem that requires more than just a light source. You need to know where you are going. You need to maintain orientation. You need to be able to find your way back. In a cave system like those of the Yucatan, where passages branch and rejoin and loop back, and where a single wrong turn can lead you away from the known route into sections that may not have exits, navigation is not a trivial challenge. It requires either exceptional spatial memory, a systematic method of marking routes, or both. The evidence for route marking in the Maya caves is among the more provocative findings of recent archaeological work in the system. In several locations, researchers have identified what appear to be deliberate marks at passage junctions. Small piles of rubble placed in positions that could serve as waypoints, subtle modifications to natural features that would not be obvious to someone who did not know to look for them, and in at least one case, a line of small stone markers running along a passage floor in a way that closely resembles trail marking techniques used by modern cavers and hikers. These markers are not guaranteed Maya work. They could be natural formations arranged by coincidence, but their distribution, their frequency at junctions rather than in the middles of passages, and their consistency across multiple sites suggests that they were made by people who had a systematic approach to navigation in the dark. The cleared pathways represent the most significant evidence of organized infrastructure in the caves. Clearing a path through a cave is not a casual undertaking. It requires removing loose rock and debris that can create tripping hazards, identifying sections where the floor level changes and where steps or ramps may be needed, and in the case of the flooded passages of the Yucatan, managing the transition between dry sections and sections that flood seasonally or permanently. The pathways found in the cave system do all of these things. They avoid the most unstable areas of cave floor. They route around low sections. In one section described by researchers, they incorporate what appear to be rudimentary steps carved into a section of sloping floor to make descent and ascent manageable in low-light conditions. The question of how long this infrastructure took to build and over how many generations of use it was maintained is one that the available evidence cannot fully answer. But the scale of the infrastructure that has been documented so far, and the fact that it has been found across multiple sites that are geographically distant from one another, suggests that the development of the Maya cave network as a usable ceremonial space was a project of considerable duration. This was not something a single community achieved in a generation. This is the accumulation of knowledge and labor across a time span measured in centuries. The acoustic properties of caves are a dimension of the Maya cave experience that has received increasing scholarly attention in recent years, and the findings in this area are genuinely surprising. Research on the acoustic properties of several cave sites in the Maya world has found that the locations within those caves where the highest concentrations of ritual material are found, where the artifacts cluster, and where the evidence of sustained use is most intense, are not chosen for topographic reasons alone. They are also chosen for acoustic reasons. They are the places in the cave where sound behaves in the most distinctive and impressive ways. Cave acoustics can be extraordinary. In chambers with the right geometry, sounds reverberate in ways that amplify certain frequencies, that create apparent echoes from surfaces that are invisible in the dark, and that in some cases produce the perception of sound arriving from directions where no sound source is present. Drumming in a cave with these properties produces an experience that is fundamentally different from drumming on the surface. The drum does not sound like a drum in the way the drum sounds above ground. It becomes something larger, something that fills the space and seems to emanate from the stone itself. Singing produces harmonics that feel externally generated. Voices seem to answer from the walls. For Maya priests performing ritual in these spaces, this acoustic environment was not a technical curiosity. It was evidence, physical and immediate evidence, that the space they were in was different from the surface world. The cave itself responded to human sound in ways that the surface world did not. The lords of Xibalba, if present, would make themselves known through exactly this kind of response. The voice that seems to come from the stone is the voice of the underworld. The echo that arrives from darkness is the acknowledgement of the dead. The Maya did not misunderstand what they were experiencing. They understood it through a different framework than the one modern acoustics provides, and within that framework, their interpretation was completely internally coherent. The construction of artificial features within the caves, beyond the pathways, and the cleared ritual areas includes elements that represent significant investment of labor and technical sophistication. Walls built across cave passages to create enclosed chambers. Platforms leveled and extended to create ritual staging areas. In one site in Belize that is above the water table and therefore accessible without diving, the cave known as ATM or Aktun Tunikil Muknal contains a burial chamber at its deepest accessible point where a young woman, approximately 18 years old at the time of her death, was placed on a raised natural platform in a position that suggests deliberate arrangement. Her skeleton has calcified over the centuries, the mineral-rich water of the cave depositing calcium carbonate across her bones until they shimmer in the lamplight like something polished. She is called the Crystal Maiden. She has been in that cave for over 1,000 years. The cave is now accessible to guided tourists, though access is carefully controlled to protect the remains and the site's integrity. Standing in the presence of the Crystal Maiden, even in a group with headlamps and a knowledgeable guide, is an experience that visitors consistently describe as unlike any other. The darkness is still dark, the stone is still stone, but something in the combination of the long passage through narrow chambers, the sounds of water, the cold, and then the sudden presence of those calcified bones in a space the size of a large room produces a response that is not easy to name and not easy to dismiss. The Maya who built the features in these caves were not primitive people fumbling in the dark. They were specialists operating within a tradition that had developed over centuries, applying accumulated knowledge of the physical properties of cave environments to the creation of ritual spaces that were precisely calibrated to produce specific experiences in the people who used them. This is engineering. It is a different kind of engineering than we are accustomed to thinking about in the context of ancient civilizations, but it is engineering nonetheless, the deliberate modification of an environment to achieve specific functional and experiential outcomes. The people who first enter a previously unvisited section of the Yucatan cave system in the modern era share something with the Maya priests who used those passages centuries before them, even if they would resist the comparison. Both groups go into complete darkness. Both groups navigate by artificial light through passages that the geological timescale measures in millions of years. Both groups understand that the water around them is not merely a physical medium, but a barrier, a challenge, a thing that will kill them if they make a significant mistake. And both groups return to the surface, changed by what they have seen. The technical cave diving community that has mapped the Yucatan underwater cave system over the past 4 decades is a small and intensely specialized group of people. Cave diving is generally considered one of the most dangerous activities that human beings engage in voluntarily, not because the equipment is unreliable or the training is inadequate, but because the environment is so unforgiving of error. A surface diver who runs out of air can ascend. A cave diver who runs out of air inside a submerged passage has no ascent available. Navigation errors in cave systems can be fatal. Equipment failures that would be merely inconvenient in open water diving become life-threatening emergencies in the enclosed darkness of a flooded passage. The cave divers who have mapped the Yucatan system have done so with the knowledge that several of their colleagues and predecessors did not come back. What this community has produced, however, is something of permanent scientific value. The maps of the cave system that have been compiled over decades of careful exploration represent one of the most significant contributions to Mesoamerican archaeology and geology made in the 20th and early 21st centuries. The discovery of human remains in previously unexplored chambers, the documentation of ritual material in contexts unreachable without diving equipment, the identification of underwater geological features that illuminate the Yucatan's climate history, all of these are the product of people who chose to go into very dangerous darkness in search of things that mattered. Among the more experienced divers working in the Yucatan system, there is a category of experience that comes up repeatedly in interviews and that the divers themselves tend to describe with a certain careful circumspection, neither dismissing what they experienced nor claiming more than they can account for. These are experiences of disorientation, of the peculiar psychological effects of extended time in complete darkness and cold water that the divers sometimes describe in terms that sound, when you hear them, not entirely unlike the descriptions of Xibalba in the Popol Vuh. One diver, a highly experienced researcher who has spent hundreds of hours in the Yucatan cave system, described an experience in a large chamber deep in a section that had not previously been visited as follows. There was no language available to him that fully accounted for what happened. The chamber was large enough that his light could not reach its far walls. The water was exceptionally clear. He was alone, which is not the protocol for safe cave diving, but which sometimes happens in the context of extended exploration when teams separate at decision points. In the silence and the dark, with the beam of his light the only reference point in what seemed like a limitless space, he had the overwhelming sensation of not being alone. Not in the sense of another diver, in the sense of presence, a quality of the space that was more than the space itself. He is a careful man. He is a scientist. He does not use the word supernatural without significant qualification. He says that what he experienced was most likely the product of the combination of isolation, darkness, cold, the slight effects of nitrogen narcosis possible at the depth he was working, and the accumulated knowledge of what he knew to be in these caves, namely, the remains of the people who had used them for purposes he was only beginning to understand. He says he does not know whether what he felt was real in any sense beyond the phenomenological, meaning the sense in which all experience is real to the person having it. He says he did not stay in the chamber. He documented what he came to document and left. And he says that when he thinks about the Maya priests who performed their rituals in chambers like that one, without the knowledge that it was nitrogen narcosis and sensory deprivation producing the presence they felt, he understands something about the Popol Vuh that he did not understand before. This is the quality of experience that the most serious researchers bring back from the caves. Not the sensationalism of supernatural encounter, not the dismissive skepticism of a discipline that has learned to distrust anything that cannot be measured. Something in between, something that honors the complexity of what it means to spend time in a place where the boundary between the physical world and the world of human meaning becomes very thin and very hard to locate precisely. The modern discovery of the cave systems has also produced a collision of interests that is not always comfortable to describe. The communities of the Yucatan and Quintana Roo, whose ancestors created the ritual landscape of the caves, are not uniformly enthusiastic about the scientific and tourist use of those spaces. For some Maya communities and cultural organizations, the flooded caves are not ancient history. They are living, sacred geography, places that remain significant in contemporary Maya spiritual practice, places where the relationship between the human and the divine in its Maya configuration is still operative and still requiring respectful engagement. The tensions between the archaeological imperative to document and study, the commercial interest in making the caves accessible to tourism, and the cultural and spiritual interests of contemporary Maya communities are ongoing and unresolved. They are handled differently in different locations and by different institutions, with varying degrees of success. The most thoughtful research projects in the Yucatan cave system work in explicit collaboration with Maya community representatives, seeking to ensure that the scientific work and the cultural heritage interests of the communities whose ancestors created the cave landscape are not in fundamental conflict. These collaborations are not always easy, and the negotiations they require are not always comfortable. But they are necessary, because the caves are not simply an archaeological site in the neutral sense of a place where human activity happened in the past. They are the landscape of a living culture's relationship with its deepest history. The technology available to modern cave researchers has expanded dramatically in recent years in ways that are producing new insights at a pace that would have seemed impossible to earlier generations. Underwater photogrammetry, which uses overlapping photographs to create precise three-dimensional models of cave geometry, has allowed researchers to document cave features in far more detail than was previously possible. DNA analysis of ancient human remains has begun to reveal population relationships that are not visible in the skeletal material alone. Chemical analysis of cave sediment has provided climate data extending back thousands of years, data that in several cases corresponds to periods of cultural stress recorded in the Maya historical record, and that illuminates the relationship between climate change, drought, and the intensification of cave ritual use that appears in the archaeological record from certain periods. The climate connection is particularly significant for understanding the timing and intensity of cave use. The Maya civilization experienced several major drought events during the Classic period, particularly in the 8th and 9th centuries CE, that are now understood to be major factors in the political collapse and depopulation of many classic Maya centers that archaeologists have documented across the Maya lowlands. The cave ritual evidence from those same centuries shows a significant increase in the richness and intensity of the material deposited in cave contexts. More offerings, more elaborate offerings, more evidence of complex ritual performance in deep cave locations that required significant effort to reach. The correlation is consistent with what the Popol Vuh and the broader Maya ritual literature would predict. When the relationship with Xibalba most needed to be maintained, when the lords of death most needed to be negotiated with, The intensity of the ritual engagement with the underground world increased. There is a game being played in Xibalba. The Popol Vuh is specific about this. The underworld has a ball court, and the game played there is the same game played on the surface, the Mesoamerican ball game, whose rubber ball and stone markers and distinctive eye-shaped court are among the most consistent archaeological signatures of ancient Mesoamerican civilization across a geography stretching from the American Southwest to Honduras. The game is played in the underworld. The prize for winning is life. The penalty for losing is death. And the logic that connects the surface game to the underworld game illuminates something essential about the Maya cosmological imagination. The Maya ball game has been described by scholars in many ways, as a ritual reenactment of cosmic events, as a form of sacrifice in which the losers were put to death, as a diplomatic and political mechanism for resolving conflicts between centers without warfare, as a sport in the ordinary sense of competitive physical performance. The truth, as with most aspects of Maya culture, is that multiple of these descriptions are simultaneously accurate. The game was a sport and a ritual and a political act and a cosmic reenactment all at the same time. The Maya did not recognize the distinctions between these categories that modern Western thinking imposes on them. What is relevant to our subject tonight is the specific form of the cosmic connection. The ball game in Maya iconography is closely associated with the sun's journey through the underworld. The sun, in Maya cosmology, does not disappear at night. It descends into Xibalba. It passes through the underworld during the hours of darkness, battling the lords of death in the form of the night sun, and emerges reborn in the east at dawn. The ball in the game is the sun. The court is the underworld path. The motion of the ball from one end of the court to the other represents the sun's passage through Xibalba. And the stakes of the game, which can include the sacrifice of the losing team, are not arbitrary cruelty, but a reflection of the cosmic reality that the sun's daily resurrection requires something. Something must be offered to sustain the cycle. The ball courts found throughout the Maya world are among the most architecturally significant structures of Maya civilization. They are present at virtually every major Maya center, from Chichen Itza, which has the largest ball court in Mesoamerica, to smaller regional centers that invested in ball court construction as a demonstration of their connection to the cosmic order that the game represents. The alignment of ball courts with astronomical phenomena, particularly the horizon positions of celestial bodies at solstices and equinoxes, has been documented at multiple sites and suggests that the game was not merely symbolically connected to cosmic events, but was performed at cosmologically significant moments. At Chichen Itza, the Great Ball Court, which is approximately 168 meters long, has acoustic properties that have been studied extensively, and that represent a form of engineering whose sophistication continues to astonish researchers. At certain positions within the court, sounds produced at one end of the court can be heard clearly at the other end, a distance of over 100 meters, without amplification. Whispered conversations carry across the full length of the court under the right conditions. Clapped sounds produce echoes of remarkable precision. The acoustic design of this space was intentional. It created an environment in which the sounds of the game, the impact of the rubber ball on stone, The cries of players, the roar of the crowd, were not simply noise, but were transformed by the space into something that had the quality of cosmic significance. The connection between the above-ground ball court and the underground cave ritual is not metaphorical, but structural. The ball court at Chichen Itza is positioned in relation to the major cenote of the site, the sacred cenote, in a way that is clearly deliberate. The sacred cenote lies at the end of a raised causeway that runs from the central platform of the site. Objects recovered from the sacred cenote over decades of research, including the dredging operations of Edward Thompson in the early 20th century and subsequent systematic scientific investigation, include exactly the categories of material found in the deep cave ritual contexts: jade, obsidian, ceramics, incense burners, and human remains. The cenote received the same class of offerings as the deep caves. It was the same kind of place in the cosmological geography of the site. The political dimensions of Xibalba are worth examining because they illuminate something about the Maya that is easy to miss in accounts that focus on the supernatural aspects of the underworld tradition. The ability to communicate with Xibalba, to enter the underworld and return, to demonstrate mastery of the relationship with the Lords of Death, was a source of political legitimacy of the highest order. Maya rulers throughout the classic period depicted themselves in precisely this role, as the intermediaries between the surface world and the underworld, as the individuals capable of making the cosmic negotiations that kept the world in proper order. Maya royal iconography is saturated with underworld imagery. The jaguar throne, the snake-footed deity, the skeletal faces that appear on royal headdresses and regalia, all of these reference the underworld and the ruler's mastery of its powers. The bloodletting rituals performed by Maya rulers, in which their own blood was drawn, usually from the tongue or other sensitive areas, and the blood collected on bark paper that was then burned to send it as smoke into the supernatural realm, were explicitly understood as communication with the underworld. The ruler who bled was the ruler who spoke to the dead, and speaking to the dead was power of a kind that no army could replicate. The cave context was the setting for many of these royal ritual performances. Evidence of bloodletting in the form of bone awls, obsidian lancets, and in some cases actual blood residue preserved in cave sediment has been found in cave ritual contexts across the Maya world. The caves were the place where the boundary between the living ruler and the dead ancestors was thinnest, where the conversation between the political present and the spiritual past could be conducted most directly, and the ruler who could go into the cave, perform the ritual, and come back with something to report, whether a vision, a communication, or simply the demonstration of having survived the encounter, was a ruler whose authority was grounded in something more than military force or inherited position. It was grounded in the demonstrated ability to navigate the cosmos. The classic Maya collapse is one of the great puzzles of ancient history. Between roughly 800 and 1000 CE, dozens of Maya centers that had been thriving urban and political entities for centuries underwent catastrophic population decline, political fragmentation, and in some cases, complete abandonment. The causes of the collapse are still debated, but the consensus that has emerged from several decades of research involving archaeology, paleoclimatology, and historical analysis points toward a combination of factors: prolonged and severe drought, political instability, warfare between competing centers, and the failure of the political and ritual systems that had held the Maya world together to adapt quickly enough to the combination of stresses they faced. The cave record from the collapse period is extraordinarily suggestive. The increase in cave ritual activity during the centuries of greatest stress, which we have already noted, does not tell the whole story. What the cave record also shows is a change in the character of the ritual activity. The offerings from earlier periods tend to be elaborate, carefully prepared, of high material quality. The offerings from the late Classic and Terminal Classic periods, the centuries of greatest stress and eventual collapse, show signs of improvisation, of using what was available rather than what was required, of performing rituals in circumstances that do not allow the full protocol to be observed. This is not the archaeology of a culture abandoning its beliefs. It is the archaeology of a culture trying desperately to maintain its beliefs under conditions that make the full expression of those beliefs increasingly impossible. The Maya, as the droughts deepened and the political structures weakened, and the agricultural surpluses that had supported the priestly class shrank, did not stop going into the caves. They went more intensively, with less, with greater urgency, as if the failure of the surface world to respond to their efforts could be corrected by deeper, more committed engagement with the underground one. There is something in this picture that is simultaneously heartbreaking and illuminating. Heartbreaking because we know how the story ends, the political collapse that the intensifying ritual could not prevent. Illuminating because it shows us the depth of the commitment, the sincerity of the engagement, the degree to which the cave tradition was not a peripheral aspect of Maya civilization, but something so central that even in extremis, even as everything else was failing, it was maintained and intensified rather than abandoned. The question of what happened to the cave tradition in the centuries after the Classic collapse is complicated by the unevenness of the collapse itself. The southern Maya lowlands, where the collapse was most severe, saw a dramatic reduction in cave ritual activity that corresponds to the reduction in population and political organization. But the northern Yucatan, where the collapse was less complete, and where several significant centers, most notably Chichen Itza and later Mayapan, continued to function into the post-Classic period, shows continuous cave and cenote ritual activity through the centuries that follow. The tradition did not die with the Classic period. It contracted, shifted geographically, adapted to changed political circumstances, and persisted. At the time of the Spanish conquest in the 16th century, cenote ritual was still an active practice in the Yucatan. The sacred cenote at Chichen Itza, which had been in use for centuries before the Spanish arrived, continued to receive offerings into the period of early colonial contact. The Spanish colonial authorities, with their characteristic combination of genuine horror at what they interpreted as devil worship and practical interest in the gold and jade that were known to have been deposited in such places, took varying approaches to the cenote traditions they encountered, ranging from outright suppression to quiet tolerance of practices they could not easily eliminate without the cooperation of communities they depended on for labor and agricultural production. Some of what was done in the cenotes in the colonial and post-colonial periods represents a continuous tradition reaching back to the Classic period and beyond. Some of it was reconstituted practice, ritual that had been suppressed and then revived, or maintained in secret and then brought back into visibility when political conditions permitted. The relationship between contemporary Maya spiritual practice involving caves and cenotes and the ancient practice documented in the archaeological record is not a simple one of unbroken continuity, but it is not a complete break either. Something persists, something carried through the trauma of conquest and colonization and suppression that allows the contemporary Maya practitioner who enters a cave with incense and prayer to be doing something that is recognizably connected to what the classic period priest was doing in the same cave 1,000 years before. The water in the Yucatan cave system is extraordinarily clear. Divers who have worked in both the Yucatan system and in cave systems in other parts of the world consistently describe the Yucatan water as exceptional, sometimes likening it to swimming through liquid glass. The reason for this clarity is the limestone itself. As rainwater passes through the limestone rock, it dissolves impurities and is filtered to a degree of purity unusual in aquatic systems. The result is water with almost no suspended particulate matter. Water that transmits light with a fidelity that allows visibility of 20 or 30 meters in some sections of the cave, a range that is extraordinary in any diving context and almost incomprehensible to people whose experience of visibility extends to the few meters typical of most surface diving. This clarity is one of the reasons the cave system has preserved its archaeological content so well. Objects deposited in the water are not covered by sediment the way objects in turbid water environments would be. They rest on the cave floor in the positions where they were placed or where they fell, sometimes partially covered by the thin mineral deposits that the water precipitates over time, but essentially visible and intact in the positions they reached when they came to rest. A ceramic vessel placed on a ledge in the 1st century CE can still be sitting on that ledge, in that position, in a state of preservation that would be remarkable, even in a museum context. The clarity of the water also means that the visual experience of diving in the Yucatan cave system is described by those who have done it as qualitatively different from any other diving experience. The combination of the remarkable visibility, the complex three-dimensional geometry of the cave, the formations that have been growing for hundreds of thousands of years, and the knowledge of what the space was used for produces something that even the most empirically rigorous researchers find difficult to describe in purely technical terms. One researcher described the experience of arriving, after a 40-minute swim through a complex cave system, at a large chamber where a collection of ceramic vessels was arranged on a series of natural ledges as being among the most powerful experiences of her professional life. Not because of the supernatural associations of the place, she is careful to say, but because of the combination of beauty, preservation, and human meaning concentrated in that single space. The water also remembers climate. The chemistry of the water in the Yucatan cave system carries information about the climate history of the region that is not available from any surface source. Stalagmites and stalactites, the mineral formations that grow on cave floors and ceilings, incorporate chemical signals from the water that deposited them, signals that reflect the temperature, rainfall, and vegetation conditions at the surface at the time the deposit formed. By analyzing the chemistry of these formations, layer by layer, Using uranium-thorium dating to establish the age of each layer, researchers have been able to reconstruct the climate history of the Yucatan with a resolution that approaches the annual scale over the past several thousand years. The climate record recovered from Yucatan cave formations is one of the most significant contributions of the cave system to science outside the direct archaeological domain. It shows in extraordinary detail the sequence of drought events that correlate with the periods of greatest stress in the Maya archaeological record. The droughts of the Terminal Classic period, the centuries of the Maya collapse, appear in the cave record as clearly as they appear in the pollen records from lake sediments and the isotopic records from archaeological contexts. The cave system is, among its other functions, a climate archive of exceptional quality. What the water does not remember, or what it remembers in ways we cannot yet read, is the content of the conversations that the Maya held with Xibalba over the centuries they used these spaces. The water has preserved the objects. It has preserved some of the bones. It has preserved the formations that carry the climate record. But the prayers spoken in these spaces, the names called into the dark, the negotiations conducted with the lords of death across the boundary of a flame and a cloud of copal smoke, these have no physical record. They happened, and then they dissolved into the water and the dark as completely as the copal smoke dissolved into the cave air. We know they happened. We have no way of recovering their content. This is the specific quality of loss that the Yucatan cave record presents to scholars of Maya civilization. The material evidence is exceptionally well preserved. The intangible evidence, the words and thoughts and experiences that constitute the interior life of the people who used these spaces, is gone as completely as if it had never existed. What the Maya felt when they descended into the dark, what they understood themselves to be doing, what they experienced in the hours or days they spent in the cave before returning to the surface, is accessible to us only indirectly through the texts and images that survive from the surface context and through the careful inference that archaeology permits when the material evidence is good enough to support it. The inference is not nothing. The inference, accumulated over decades of careful work by researchers who take both the material and the textual evidence seriously, has produced a picture of Maya cave ritual that is genuinely detailed and genuinely illuminating. We know more about what happened in these spaces than we knew a generation ago, and we will know more still as the research continues. But the core of the experience, the thing that made a Maya priest willing to go deep into the dark with a torch and an incense burner and a prayer and the knowledge that the lords of death were waiting, is something we can approach but not fully enter. Like the sealed chamber behind the collapsed passage in the deep cave system, it is there, and its presence is registered, but the direct access to its contents is not yet available to us. There is a word that comes up in contemporary discussions of Xibalba and the Maya underworld that it is worth pausing on, because it is both accurate and misleading at the same time. That word is gateway. Xibalba is frequently described as a gateway to the underworld, as if the cave system is a doorway between two separate and distinct realms that would otherwise have no connection. But the Maya understanding of the relationship between Xibalba and the surface world was not a gateway model. It was a membrane model. In the Maya cosmological understanding, Xibalba was not behind a door that could be opened and closed. It was everywhere below the surface, present in the same way that the aquifer is present below the limestone, not separated from the surface world by a physical barrier, but continuous with it, interpenetrating it, accessible from it at every point where the surface world opens downward. The cenote is not a gate in the sense of a discrete opening between two separate places. It is a place where the membrane becomes thin enough to pass through. This distinction matters because it changes the character of the relationship between the living and the dead in Maya cosmology. The dead are not gone to a place entirely separate from the living. They are below, in the same landscape, occupying its underground dimension, accessible through the same geological features that supply water to the living. The boundary between the living and the dead is real and requires specific rituals to cross in either direction, but it is not absolute. It is a membrane, not a wall. And membranes, by their nature, permit exchange in both directions. The exchange that the Maya conducted with Xibalba across that membrane was not one-directional. The offerings that went down into the cenotes and the caves were not simply tribute paid to powers that could not be refused. They were part of a reciprocal relationship in which what went down was exchanged for what came up. What came up, in the Maya understanding, included rain. The cenotes are the surface expressions of the aquifer, and the aquifer is fed by rainfall that percolates through the limestone. Rain comes from the sky, passes through the limestone, and emerges in the cenotes. The cycle of rainfall is therefore, in the physical reality of the Yucatan, a cycle that connects sky and underground in a continuous loop. And in Maya cosmology, the underground is also where the rain comes from in a different sense. The agricultural fertility of the surface world depends on the goodwill of the underworld powers who govern the rain cycle. Chak, the Maya rain deity, is an underworld figure as much as he is a sky deity. His home is not unambiguously above the world. He is associated with caves, with the darkness below the ground, with the water that flows through the underground system before it reaches the surface. Making offerings to Chak in the cenotes is not sending a message into an alien realm. It is returning something to the origin of the thing you want more of. The rain that keeps your crops alive comes from somewhere. Sending something back to that somewhere is simply good, reciprocal practice. The contemporary relevance of this cosmological model is more than historical. The Yucatan Aquifer is one of the largest and most important groundwater systems in the Americas. It supplies drinking water to millions of people in Mexico and is the hydrological foundation of the region's agriculture and tourism industries. That aquifer is under pressure. The population of the Yucatan Peninsula has grown enormously in recent decades, particularly along the Caribbean coast, where resort development has transformed what were remote fishing villages into major tourist destinations. The water extraction demands of this population, combined with agricultural use and the effects of climate change on regional rainfall patterns, are producing stress on the aquifer system that researchers are tracking with increasing concern. The cave system that the Maya understood as the entrance to Xibalba is also the plumbing of the aquifer. The passages through which researchers now swim in search of archaeological and geological knowledge are the same passages through which the water flows that sustains the surface world above. When that water is compromised, whether by over-extraction, by contamination from surface development, or by the changes in recharge rates that accompany climate shifts, the cave system itself changes. Passages that were stable become unstable. The chemistry of the water that preserves the archaeological record shifts. The clarity that makes the cave system visually extraordinary diminishes. The Maya who developed their relationship with Xibalba over 2 millennia were not naive about the connection between the underground world and the surface world's health. Their ritual engagement with the cave system was, among other things, a form of sustained attention to the underground that kept them aware of its condition and responsive to changes in it. The absence of that sustained ritual engagement does not make the underground any less present or any less significant. It only means that the attention paid to it is now organized differently, through science and resource management rather than through ceremony, and that the connection between what happens underground and what happens on the surface is understood through different frameworks than the ones that produced Xibalba. The question of whether those different frameworks produce better outcomes for the relationship between human communities and their underground water systems is not one that archaeology can answer. But the longevity of the Maya engagement with the Yucatan aquifer, 2,000 years of intensive use of a resource system that the modern world is now straining in decades, suggests that the frameworks they developed were at least adequate to the task of maintaining that relationship across a very long time. Whatever they believed about the Lords of Death and the membrane between the living and the dead, they kept their relationship with the underground coherent and functional for a period that dwarfs the duration of the modern industrial economy that is now its principal competitor for the same resource. The skull placed on the ledge, facing the entrance of the cave, looking toward whoever comes next. We began with that image. It is worth returning to it now, after we have traversed the geography and the mythology and the archaeology, and asking what it means. One interpretation is straightforward. It is a warning. This is the underworld. This is what happens to those who enter without proper preparation. The skull is the outcome of the journey, the reminder that the Lords of Death are real and their jurisdiction is absolute. Turn back, or if you must enter, enter correctly, with the right offerings and the right knowledge and the right relationship with the powers that govern this space. Another interpretation is more generous. It is a greeting. The skull belongs to someone who made the journey, who passed through Xibalba and was transformed by it, who now occupies the in-between space of the cave entrance as a kind of intermediary, a presence that belongs to neither the surface world nor the deep underground, but to the threshold between them. The skull facing outward is not threatening the next person who enters. It is receiving them, acknowledging their arrival, and perhaps offering some version of guidance. You have come here as we came. We went further than the entrance. You may too, if you know what you are doing. A third interpretation comes from the research itself. It is a datum, a data point in the archaeological record of a ritual tradition that used this space for purposes that the material evidence partially documents and partially conceals. The skull was placed here by someone. That someone had reasons that were internally coherent within the cultural framework they inhabited. Understanding those reasons requires the full context of the Maya cosmological system, the material culture of the site, the dating of the associated objects, and the comparative data from other sites. The skull is not inherently mysterious. It is inherently complex. The mystery is the gap between what we know and what we need to know to fully account for it. All three of these interpretations are, in their own way, correct. The skull is a warning and a greeting and a datum. The cave is an underworld and a hydrological system and an archaeological site. Xibalba is a mythology and a geography and a ritual technology. The Maya, who created all of this, were not operating in the simplified, single-framework reality that popular accounts sometimes attribute to ancient civilizations. They were operating in a reality of multiple simultaneous truths, a reality where the physical and the spiritual and the political were not separate domains requiring separate explanations, but aspects of a single integrated world that required an integrated understanding. The difficulty we have in fully understanding the Maya cave tradition is not simply a problem of missing evidence, though missing evidence is real and significant. It is a problem of framework. The frameworks through which most modern Western people understand the relationship between the human world and the natural world, between the living and the dead, between the individual and the cosmos, are different from the frameworks through which the Maya understood those relationships. The differences are not trivial. They are deep enough that fully understanding the Maya framework from the outside, without having grown up inside it, is probably not entirely possible. This is not an argument for mysticism or for the unknowability of the past. It is an argument for intellectual humility of the specific kind that the best archaeology requires. The willingness to approach the evidence without assuming that your own frameworks are the appropriate ones for interpreting it. The willingness to let the evidence tell you what frameworks might be necessary to understand it. And the willingness to sit with uncertainty when the evidence and the frameworks are not yet aligned well enough to produce confident conclusions. The skull on the ledge in the dark Yucatan cave has been sitting in that position for 1,000 years or more. It was placed there by someone who understood their reasons clearly. Those reasons have not yet been fully recovered. They may never be fully recovered. The evidence that would allow us to say with confidence exactly who placed it, exactly when, exactly in the context of what ritual, exactly in the service of what relationship with which Lords of Death, is not available and may never become available. What is available is the skull, the ledge, the cave, the pottery around it, and the accumulated context of everything we know about the people who created this landscape. That context is enough to understand that what we are looking at is not primitive. It is not simple. It is not the superstition of people who did not know better. It is the work of people who knew exactly what they were doing, who did it deliberately and skillfully and with a depth of intention that 2,000 years of water has not erased from the objects they left behind. The sophistication is in the system, not just in the individual artifacts. The sophistication is in the sustained attention, the organized protocol, the calibrated technology of experience that the cave tradition represents. The sophistication is in the skull, facing the entrance, positioned to receive whatever comes next, with whatever combination of warning and welcome and accumulated human wisdom the people who placed it intended to convey. We have been underground for some time now, not physically, not in the way that the cave divers go underground or the way that the Maya priests went underground with their torches and their incense and their careful preparation for whatever awaited them in the dark, but in the way that attention goes underground when it follows an idea into its depths and keeps following it past the comfortable stopping points, past the places where the general picture is clear enough and the specific details can be left vague, past the reassuring conclusions and into the space where the evidence becomes difficult and the frameworks require examination. And the honest answer to the most important questions is that the honest answer is not yet fully available. What have we established? We have established that the Maya created one of the most elaborate and internally consistent cosmological systems for understanding the relationship between the living and the dead that any human civilization has produced. We have established that this system was not purely theoretical, but was grounded in the physical landscape of the Yucatan Peninsula, specifically in the flooded cave system that the Maya understood as the geography of Xibalba. We have established that the Maya entered those caves physically, repeatedly, systematically, over a period of at least 2,000 years, and that they left behind material evidence of their entry that is among the most significant archaeological finds of the past several decades. We have established that the infrastructure they built in those caves, the pathways and the cleared ritual spaces, and the arranged offerings and the human remains, represents a sophisticated engagement with a challenging physical environment that required accumulated knowledge, organized effort, and sustained commitment across many generations. We have established that the ritual technology they developed in those caves, the use of darkness, acoustics, cold, disorientation, and altered states of consciousness, was calibrated to produce specific experiential outcomes in the people who used it, outcomes that reinforced and deepened the cosmological system within which those experiences were interpreted. And we have established that the mystery that remains in the cave system is not a failure of archaeological work, but the natural condition of an engagement with the past, where the physical evidence, though remarkably well preserved, is not sufficient by itself to recover the full interior life of the people who created it. The skull on the ledge will not speak. The water will not give back the prayers it received. The dark will not replay the experiences that happened in it. What we have is what the material world gives back to patient, careful, systematic attention: objects, formations, remains, chemical traces, and the accumulating context of a tradition that becomes, through the accumulation of research, slightly less opaque with every year of serious work. The connection between life and death in Maya culture is not the connection between opposite states. It is the connection between two phases of a single, continuous process. The Maya did not understand death as the end of the story. They understood it as a passage through a specific landscape, governed by specific powers, subject to specific rules, and ultimately leading to a transformation rather than an ending. The soul that navigated Xibalba successfully did not simply cease to exist. It was reborn in forms that the surviving texts describe in ways that are not entirely clear to us, but that were clearly meaningful and specific to the people who understood them. This understanding of death as transformation rather than ending gave the Maya a relationship with their dead that is qualitatively different from the relationships with the dead that most modern Western traditions support. The dead, in Maya cosmology, are not gone. They are underground, in Xibalba, in the care of the Lords of Death, undergoing the process that will eventually result in their return in some form to the living world. They can be communicated with through the cenotes and the caves. They have interests that can be served by the living, and the living have interests that the dead can serve in return. The relationship continues after death. It simply changes its character. Standing at the edge of a cenote in the Yucatan on a still morning, before the tourists arrive and the tour boats begin their circuits of the crystal water, it is possible to feel something of what the Maya felt here. Not the full weight of the cosmological system, not the specific content of 2,000 years of ritual tradition, but the more basic thing that the cosmological system was built around. The physical reality of a place where the surface world opens downward into something vast and dark and cool and full of the sound of water. The cenote does not require a mythology to be impressive. It requires only itself. But the mythology makes it more than impressive. The mythology makes it a place where the negotiations between the living and the dead can be conducted, where something essential about the relationship between the human world and the world that surrounds and underlies it can be addressed directly rather than indirectly, where the answers to the questions that cannot be answered on the surface, about death, about what comes after, about the relationship between the individual life and the larger processes in which that life participates, might be found, or at least approached, in the dark below. The Maya did not have answers that we do not have. They had frameworks for living with the questions, frameworks developed over 2 millennia of sustained attention to the landscape they inhabited, and the traditions they inherited, and the experiences they generated in cave rituals that pushed human consciousness against the edge of what it can endure and observe. Those frameworks are not available to us in the simple sense of being transferable, but they are available to us in the sense that the evidence of their existence and operation is preserved in the caves and the texts and the iconography, waiting to be read as carefully and honestly as the evidence permits. The next diver who goes into the deep system of the Yucatan will see things that no human eyes have seen since the Maya priests who last used those passages 1,000 years ago. The skull on the ledge will still be facing the entrance. The offerings on the platform will still be in the positions where they were placed. The water will still be extraordinarily clear, transmitting the light of a modern LED headlamp through a medium that has been transmitting light since the universe was less than 14 billion years old. And the Lords of Death, if they are present in any sense at all, will receive the diver with whatever combination of warning and welcome they have been offering to every person who has entered their domain since the first Maya priest carried a torch into the dark and decided to go further than the entrance. That decision, to go further than the entrance, is the essential act of both archaeology and mythology. It is the decision of the hero twins descending into Xibalba. It is the decision of the cave diver leaving the light behind. It is the decision of the researcher who keeps following the evidence past the comfortable stopping points. The dark does not reveal itself to people who stop at the entrance. It reveals itself slowly and incompletely to people who go further in and who pay attention to what they find and who come back to report what they saw and who are honest about what they could not see. There is something down there. The skull on the ledge is evidence of that. The carefully laid pathways are evidence of that. The offerings arranged on platforms by hands that have been gone for 1,000 years are evidence of that. The evidence says someone cared about this place enough to come here repeatedly across generations and leave something that has survived to be found. Whatever they cared about, whatever they were doing, whatever they understood about the dark beneath the limestone, it mattered to them enough to sustain 2,000 years of effort. That kind of sustained collective effort does not happen by accident. It happens because something real is being engaged. Whether the real thing being engaged is the lords of death, or the human psyche, or the relationship between a civilization and its water supply, or all three at once, is the question that the research has not yet fully answered. And the honest answer to that question is that the research is not done. The cave goes deeper. The passages continue. The sealed chamber at the end of the blocked corridor waits. You have come a long way tonight, through the dripping darkness of a flooded cave, through the narrative complexity of the Popol Vuh, through the careful testimony of researchers who have gone into the underwater dark and come back with things to report, through the political dimensions of underworld mythology and the climate science encoded in limestone formations and the acoustic engineering of spaces designed to make the presence of the Lords of Death physically felt. What I find most remarkable about the Maya engagement with Xibalba is not the drama of it, though there is genuine drama in the skull on the ledge, and the Crystal Maiden in the Belizean cave, and the 12 Lords of Death with their specific portfolios of destruction. What is most remarkable is the seriousness of it. The Maya took the relationship between the living and the dead seriously enough to invest 2,000 years of sustained effort in maintaining it, seriously enough to develop a sophisticated ritual technology for engaging with the underground world, seriously enough to send their best practitioners into the dark with everything that required to go in and come back, and seriously enough to embed the whole system so deeply in the physical landscape of their civilization that the water they drank, and the rain that fed their crops, and the calendar that organized their lives were all part of the same integrated relationship with Xibalba. That seriousness is not diminished by the scientific frameworks we now use to understand what they were doing. The cave diver who feels the presence in the dark chamber is not experiencing the same thing as the Maya priest who felt it, but they are experiencing something in the same place through the same combination of physical conditions that connects them to every other human being who has ever gone into that dark and paid attention to what was there. That connection is real. It is not mystical in the debased popular sense of the word. It is historical, physical, and human in the deepest possible sense. The entrance to Xibalba is still there. It is marked in the Yucatan by cenotes that open in the limestone wherever you look. 6,000 of them. 10,000. More, perhaps, still to be found. Each one an opening in the membrane between the surface world and whatever lies below. Each one a place where the Maya conducted their negotiations and left their evidence and went further than the entrance. Each one still waiting, the way underground things wait, without impatience, without expectation, for whoever comes next with a light and a willingness to go in. Every culture in human history has developed some version of the relationship between the living and the dead that the Maya formalized as Xibalba. Every culture has named the darkness below and tried to understand what governs it and what must be offered to maintain a correct relationship with it. The Egyptian Duat, the Greek Hades, the Norse Helheim, the Japanese Yomi, the Tibetan Bardo. These are not the same cosmological system. They are different answers to the same fundamental question, which is the question that every human being who has ever lost someone they loved has asked. Where did they go? And is it possible to speak to them still? And what is required to maintain the relationship after the visible presence is gone? The Maya answer was specific, elaborate, and grounded in the actual landscape of the Yucatan Peninsula. It was an answer built by people who went into the dark to develop it, who tested it against experience, who refined it over centuries of practice, and who embedded it in material culture so durable that it is still recoverable, still accessible, still capable of teaching us something we did not know before. That is not a small achievement. That is, in every meaningful sense of the word, a civilization. The skull on the ledge faces the entrance. You have come in. You have gone further than the entrance. You have seen some of what is there. Now, you go back out, back to the surface, back to the light. But the dark is still there. The water is still clear. The lords of death, whatever they are still in business. And somewhere in the deep cave system of the Yucatan, in a section of passage that no modern person has yet entered, there are things that the Maya left that have not been found. Things that have been in the dark for 1,000 years, waiting, the way only things in the dark can wait. We will find them. Not all of them. Perhaps not even most of them. But the research continues. The divers go back in. The technology improves. And each year the picture becomes slightly less incomplete. The mystery is not going away. It is becoming, through sustained attention, slightly less opaque. And that is the best we can ask of any engagement with the past. Not the abolition of mystery, but its gradual, incremental, honest illumination. Before you go, I want to hear from you. Every culture has its version of the underworld, its geography of the dead, its system for understanding what comes after this life, and how the living can maintain their relationship with those who have crossed over. What does the underworld look like in the tradition you were raised in, or the tradition you have come to as an adult, or the tradition that fascinates you most? Drop it in the comments below. The geography of what lies beneath is one of the oldest maps humanity has ever tried to draw, and I am endlessly curious about every version of it. If this kind of long, careful, honest descent into difficult history is what you come here for, subscribe. There are more passages below. Some of them are darker than this one. All of them are worth entering. From the flooded caves of the Yucatan, from the skull on the ledge and the crystal maiden in the dark, and the 12 lords of death with their specific portfolios of transformation, from Xibalba, which was never just a myth, and was never just a cave, and was never just anything simple at all. Good night. Sleep well. The membrane between the worlds is thin, but it holds. And whatever the Maya believed about what passes through it, they were right about at least this much. The dark beneath the surface is real, and it goes much further than anyone has yet followed it. And the evidence of everyone who has ever gone in and come back is still down there, waiting to be found.